It is time for our newspaper review. Look at what's making the headlines around the world today. Let's start with Gulf news, which leads on Tuesday's airstrikes against Islamic State and President Obama's praise for the supporting role of 5 Arab nations.
South China Morning Post reports that despite mainland manufacturing activity picking up speed in recent months, the rising cost of borrowing is preventing a recovery in the overall economy in China.
China daily leads on the rise of a new generation of Chinese billionaires. According to the 2014 Who Ruined China Rich List, information technology has overtaken real estate as the industry for the super rich.
The Financial Times asks if tax-raising proposals outlined by British Labour leader Ed Miliband will really bring in the anticipated revenue. They're aimed at city hedge funds, the owners of expensive London homes and tobacco companies.
The International New York Times says the strike by Air France KLM pilots who oppose the management's debt reduction cutbacks is putting the future of the airline in doubt.
And The Independent reflects on David Cameron's failure to observe royal protocol when a microphone picked up the British Prime Minister telling a colleague the Queen purred down the line when he rang to tell her the Scottish referendum results.
Well, joining us is Cornelia, Meyer, Chief Executive of Meyer Resources. Good morning. Welcome.
Morning, Cornelia.
Good morning.
Let's start with, I know you're dying to get to that David Cameron story talking to the Queen, but anyway, we have important news to get to first. The Gulf news, US and Arab states jointly striking, well, they say Daesh targets, but the other name for Islamic State targets in Syria. Obviously the big story, but particularly this idea of a coalition.
Yeah, and I think that there's two things to be said about this story. One is the coalition is very notable because you have Bahrain, you have the UAE, you have Jordan, and you in there, and you have Saudi in there, and you also have Qatar in there. And it's very rarely that Saudi and Qatar actually agree on anything and work together on anything. So that's it's a broad-based coalition. So that's a very good thing. The other thing here is that I find quite interesting and a little bit disconcerting. You know, it's Daesh and Khorasan targets that they made. How do they really identify? You know, this is not like England or another Western country where you have parties and you know this person is Labour, this person. How do you really identify in this very fragmented civil war situation in Syria? How do you really identify who's who? That's a very interesting question, I think.
So you mentioned the Khorasan group. It's tripped off your tongue rather nicely, but I think until a few days ago no one had ever heard of them.
Yeah, very few people had heard of it, yes. But it really is who's a good guy, who's a bad guy. It's a very fluid. And I remember about a year or so back, we had a very similar conversation about the West supporting Syrian opposition. And it was like, oh my God, some of them are Al-Qaeda sympathizers. And again there I said, look, guys, this is not Switzerland. It's very murky.
Well, some would say Switzerland can, Swiss politics can be pretty murky as well.
That's true.
But we haven't got time for that. No. We'll have to do that another day. But let's have a look at China. This time yesterday, we were talking about that surprise news about how manufacturers are doing in China. We were expecting quite a sort of flat figure. It wasn't that amazing, but it was better than economists were expecting. And give us your take on, you know, the Chinese economy. South China Morning Post kind of using this as a reason to digest where we are now.
I think it was very good. I mean, it was better, and I think we were all very happy about it. The only problem here is, again, it was a bit of a jobless growth, and jobs are very important if you have 1.5 billion people in your country. And the other thing is the credit constraint. And what I'm worried about in China is less the credit constraint. The government has just put in 500 billion into 5 of the state-owned banks, or 2 of the 5 of the state-owned banks. I'm worried also about the loan portfolio of these banks, because they're not necessarily it's tied to real estate, and I think we have some nasty news to come here in the loan portfolio.
You should say that, because people have been saying that to me now for quite a while, for maybe over a year, about this sort of real fear of what's behind, you know, what's in the balance sheets of the big banks in China. and yet none of this nasty stuff is seeming to appear. You know, there's no property crash, there was no hard landing. You know, do you think the Chinese authorities are on it?
I think
kind
they're
of behind
on it,
the
they're
scenes.
managing it, but it reminds me, I lived in Japan in the late 1980s. It reminds me very much of the late 1980s when you just could see there was a bubble about to burst. And it's a bit reminiscent of that.
Keep an eye.
Indeed.
In the meantime, talking of bubbles.
Yeah, tech bubbles. I mean, we're staying with China daily, staying with China. So IT, I mean, no surprise really that IT and particularly e-commerce is what is making some people in China, communist China, very rich.
Yeah, well, you know, we saw it with Jack Ma, but it is again so many people. You know, 1.3, 1.5 billion people, and it is the fastest growing e-commerce market in the world. And the McKinsey Global Institute, who usually is very good on this, says 7 to 22% of Chinese growth going forward will come from the IT space.
And what do you think the Chinese authorities think about that? You know, the e-commerce space.
I think
it's a space that's hard to police, isn't it?
It's a space that's hard to police, but it's also a place that creates a lot of jobs, and they need jobs. So I mean, I think that's and I think it's the internet, it's the Facebook thing that's hard to police. E-commerce, you know, buying factories, buying from other factories things, that's not something that's terribly contentious, is it? And
you still have to keep pinching yourself. I mean, you know, I mentioned communist China, that people are still making these vast sums of money.
Yeah, but I think there's a good dose of capitalism in that particular breed of communism.
and tolerate it.
And you know, they have to manage a very complex, very big country, and they have done reasonably well over the last 20 years, I would say, haven't they?
OK, talking of capitalism and the consequences of that, the Financial Times is highlighting Ed Miliband's speech at the Labour Party conference yesterday. And, of course, this is him laying out what's important to him and the Labour Party and what he hopes is important to the voters as we head to an election next year. He vows to tap the privileged few to provide £2.5 billion boost for the National Health Service. A vote winner, perhaps, but what do you think are the consequences of this?
I think two things. One, it's good that the NHS is one of our really, really cherished institutions. So anything to do to get more, you know, to get more nurses and get nurses better paid, that's a good thing. But then going after hedge funds and the mansion tax, the question here is, will he make more money of it than he will have that there will be tax avoidance schemes, people leaving the City of London, you know, on the face of it, what will be better for the economy? And that story is unwritten as of yet.
And then quickly, this pilot strike in France is said to be bringing Air France to breaking point. I mean, it is day 10. It's been going on and on.
It is horrible because Air France has done all the right things with wanting to get a budget airline, with tripling its cash flow to 1.3 billion, finally starting to, after a decade of red figures, starting to write black figures, which is incredibly hard for an airline. So what are these people doing? I mean, these pilot people.
The sums that they're losing, I mean, it's staggering. $26 million per day.
Yes, it's staggering, and in an airline business where the margins are razor thin.
Now, let's talk about
important news.
Let's talk about David Cameron.
How dare he?
That moment when he thought we were not listening, but actually it looks like we were. He was talking to former Mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, about his conversation with the Queen the morning after the referendum.
You know, it's irrespective, it's not relevant whether the mic was off or on. He's the Prime Minister of this country. She is our sovereign, and our sovereign doesn't purr. So I mean, I don't think this is good.
Is it the choice of language then that you're worried about, rather than the fact that he had this conversation with Michael Bloomberg?
The choice of language, and also our sovereign is trying to stay away from politics. Someone can say, look, we were all relieved, it was good, all was well at the end, but we did have 45% of Scots voting to secede from the Union. But he should not have dragged the sovereign's views in there.
Yes, because I mean there is this.
There
is an unwritten rule that Prime Ministers never discuss what they discuss with the Queen, and also that the Queen stays above any constitutional matters.
Absolutely, and this is not, as we say in this country, this is not cricket.
But it happens quite regularly. I mean, not necessarily to David Cameron, but I'm thinking of, you know, George Bush and Tony Blair. I mean, you sometimes wonder, when will people learn that there are always microphones around, and it's better just to keep
if you're a president or a prime minister, wherever you are, there's a microphone. You have to assume there's always a microphone switched on. You've always have to be under control of what you say.
Thank you very much.
That's a good thought for the day, isn't it?
It is.
Thank you, Cornelia.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon. Watch what you say today. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.